Wyoming Territory, 1881. The wind carried dust across the open plain as widow Willa Prescott stood in front of her broken wagon, her two children clinging to her skirts. The sun already beginning to dip low behind the hills. The horse had snapped its leg in a gopher hole an hour east of Laramie. She did what she had to shot it clean and quick, but it left them stranded. No man, no shelter. Just her, little Grady and Grace, and a wagon wheel cracked clean through the hub. She reached down and wiped dirt from Grady's cheek. "We'll be all right," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Mama's going to figure it out." A rider came over the ridge not long after. Tall in the saddle, lean figure, hat pulled low. The kind of man who moved like he did not worry about much. He stopped when he saw her, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "You need help?" the cowboy asked, voice low, rough like river gravel. Willa nodded, stepping forward. "Wagon's busted, horses dead, no one else out here but us." He looked from her to the children, then back. "You aiming to stay the night out here?" "I am not aiming to stay anywhere," she said. "But we do not have a choice." He scratched his jaw. "Name's Xander Keene." He tipped his hat. "You from Laramie?" "We were headed there. Got a land grant waiting. My husband," she paused, jaw stiffening. "He died last winter. Fever took him in Kansas. We came west anyway." Xander's gaze softened just a notch. He crouched beside the busted wheel, ran a hand along the splintered wood. "This is not going anywhere, I know." He stood again, hands on his hips, glancing toward the horizon. "I got a place 10 miles off. Cabin, horses, tools. I can fix this wagon, but it will not be tonight. You and the young'uns can ride back with me." Grady edged behind her, clutching her skirt. Willa looked at her children, then at the man. He wore no badge, no ring, no lies in his eyes. She nodded slowly. "We will ride with you." They left the wagon behind and rode double. Grace sat in front of Xander, her tiny hands gripping the horn of the saddle, while Willa took Grady with her on the second horse. The sun went down behind them and stars blinked out above as they reached his cabin tucked beneath the pines. It was small but sturdy. One room, stone hearth, a cot in the corner. He lit a lantern and turned to her. "You and the children take the bed. I will sleep outside." "You do not have to, I do," he said, not unkindly. "I am no saint, but I am not the kind of man who takes advantage of a woman with 2 children and no wagon." Willa met his eyes for a beat, then nodded once. "Thank you." By morning the children were curled like kittens in the blanket-stuffed bed, and Xander had already split wood, water boiling for breakfast. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. "Not much," he said, "but it is hot." She took it, her fingers brushing his as she did. "It is enough." They spent the next 3 days working on the wagon. Xander rode into Laramie for parts, and Willa helped him brace the axle with his tools. She was stronger than he expected. Sharper, too. Not soft-spoken like some. She had opinions and did not mind saying them. On the second night, she sat on the front steps with him, both of them watching the fireflies blink across the grass. "They said it was a good match," she said suddenly. Xander looked over. "Who did?" "My husband's family, his parents, the church, everyone. Said we made a good match." He sipped his coffee. And she looked at him, eyes steady. "The cowboy said, for who?" Xander let out a breath, slow and deep. "Was he good to you?" "He was not cruel. But he never really saw me, not as I am." He stared out at the trees for a long moment. "Some people do not know how." She nodded once, then stood. "I should check on the children." But before she went inside, she turned to him again. "Thank you for helping us." He lifted his eyes to hers. "I did not do it for thanks." She held his gaze. "I know." The next morning, Grady ran to Xander while he was saddling up. "Mr. Keene, can I help?" he asked, voice high and eager. Xander ruffled the boy's hair. "Sure can. Grab that rope and bring it over." Willa watched from a distance, arms wrapped around herself. It had only been 3 days, but already she saw the way her son looked at him, like he was something solid, something safe. That afternoon they finished the repairs. The wagon stood again, wheels sturdy and true. The horse Xander brought back from town pawed at the ground, ready to pull. Xander handed her the reins. "You are set." She looked at the wagon, then at him. "You said you had a place here, alone," he nodded. "Been that way a long time." "And that is how you like it," he shrugged. "It is what it is." Willa turned to her children. "Grady, Grace, go see if you left anything inside." They ran off, and Willa stepped closer to Xander. "You could come with us," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "To Laramie." He looked down at her. "Why would I?" She did not answer right away, just met his eyes, steady and sure. "Because you are already part of us." Xander's throat moved as he swallowed. "You do not know me." "I know enough." He looked away, then back to her. "You think this is a good match?" Willa gave him a faint smile. "The cowboy said, 'For who?'" she echoed, then her voice softened. "For me. For the children, and maybe if you let it for you." Xander reached out, brushed a stray curl from her cheek. "You sure?" She leaned into his touch. "I have not been sure of many things lately, but this, you." "I am." Behind them, the children laughed from inside the cabin, their voices carrying across the field like music. Xander looked at her, really looked. Then he nodded. "I will come." The wagon creaked steady along the rutted trail west of Laramie, pine shadows stretching long across the road as Xander rode beside it, reins loose in his hands. Willa sat high on the bench, her back straight, hands sure, her eyes scanning the land ahead like she'd always meant to lead. Grace had fallen asleep curled against a burlap sack, her ribbon slipping from her braid. Grady sat alert, legs swinging, clutching a tin whistle Xander had once carved on a dry ride through the hills. He hadn't meant to keep it, just never thought to give it away until the boy had asked what it was. They reached the edge of the property just before dusk. The modest homestead crouched between two hills. The land grant had been real, just as Willa had said, a narrow stretch of pasture hemmed by cottonwoods and rock, with a dry barn and a half-finished house of raw timber and ambition. "Still standing," she said, pulling the wagon to a halt. "That's more than I expected." Xander dismounted, brushing road dust from his sleeves. "You build this," my brother-in-law started it. "He left when the snow came." She climbed down and unlatched the back gate. Said the roof wouldn't hold. Ran off south. He stepped through the frame of the house, boots crunching over curled leaves and sawdust. The rafters were bare, the floor laid uneven, but the walls were sound and the chimney stones were set tight. "You plan on finishing it?" he asked. "I didn't carry 2 children and a plow halfway across the country to sleep in a barn. Most folks would have given up." "I'm not most folks," she said, setting her jaw. He didn't argue. He just rolled up his sleeves and went to work. They camped that night under the stars, the children nestled in wool blankets, the scent of pine smoke winding through the air. Xander stacked wood near the eastern wall come morning, and Willa joined him with a hammer, her movements exact. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. She handed him nails without asking, and he held the beam steady when she climbed the ladder. By the 3rd day, the roof was half covered. Xander nailed down the last board before dusk and wiped his brow. Willa stepped back, arms folded. "We'll still need to seal it before snow," she said. "I'll ride into town for pitch." She hesitated, then asked, "You plan on coming back after that?" He looked at her, not blinking. "I didn't come this far to leave." Her expression shifted, quiet as the breeze lifting the edge of her skirt. She nodded once and turned toward the wagon. Inside the barn, he found Grady tying twine between 2 posts. The boy looked up, grinning. "I'm making a fence for my fort." Xander crouched beside him. "Need help with the gate? Can you show me how?" He took the twine and began knotting it firm. "You ever build a snare?" Grady shook his head. You will. Willa watched from the doorway, arms crossed loosely. She didn't interrupt, didn't call him to supper, just stood there as the light faded and the boy learned something new. That night, she poured boiled beans into a tin bowl and handed it to Xander. I never asked what brought you west. He stirred the beans with his spoon. Left Georgia after the war, too many ghosts, nothing worth staying for. She didn't press. Just asked, you ever think you'd settle? Didn't figure it was in the cards. She handed him a cup of water. People can change their minds, he took it. Only if there's reason. She sat beside him, knees drawn close, her shoulder nearly touching his. I want to plant corn come spring, she said. And beans. Maybe try squash if the land's kind to it, he nodded. You'll need to clear more ground. I can do it. He looked at her then, truly looked at the lines near her mouth, the way her hands bore the same calluses as his. You shouldn't have to do it alone. I don't plan to, she said. Silence stretched between them, full and unhurried. The fire snapped. From the barn, Grace's laugh rose like a bird call, then faded. I meant what I said, he told her. Back at the cabin. She turned her head toward him. Which part? That I wasn't doing it for thanks. Willa reached out and took the empty bowl from his hands. Her fingers lingered on his for just a breath longer than needed. I know you weren't, she said, but I'm grateful just the same. He didn't answer, just let the quiet settle. The next morning they hauled the last beam into place, the children running circles around the posts. Xander caught Grady up under one arm and swung him high, both of them laughing. Willa stood by the doorframe, hands on her hips. You're good with them. He set the boy down. Didn't think I would be. You are, she said. Then, after a pause, you're good with me too. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of cedar and promise. Xander stepped closer, his voice low and certain. This what we're building here at yours alone, or are you asking me to stay? She looked up at him, her eyes steady. I'm not asking. He reached out, touched her hand. Then I will. The first frost came early, silvering the dry grass and drawing steam from the horses' backs as they worked the land. Xander drove the breaking plow while Willa walked behind it, her boots dark with churned soil. The children gathered kindling near the creek, wrapped tight in wool, their voices muffled in the stillness. At midday, she wiped her brow with the back of her wrist and leaned on the plow handles. Soil's deeper here than I thought, she said. Xander stepped down from the trace harness, flexing his fingers. That ridge to the north's holding the wind, might keep the snow off longer come winter. She glanced toward the rise, then back at him. You see things most men miss. I had years to get quiet enough to notice. He crouched beside the furrow, scooping a handful of soil between his palms. You planting rows or mounds? Mounds, she said. Easier on the roots, and if the rains come hard, they won't drown. He nodded, then stood. I've seen land like this east of Medicine Bow. Good for beans. She studied him. You've been everywhere. Not everywhere, just never stayed one place long. You think you'll stay here? She asked, her voice soft but direct. He didn't answer right away. I reckon I already have. That night, she found him in the barn, working over a bent bridle, lamplight casting long shadows along the beams. She leaned against the wall, arms folded. I never learned to read maps properly, she said. Xander looked up, brow raised. My husband always said it wasn't necessary. Said women didn't need to know where they were going as long as someone else was leading. He set the bridle aside. And what do you say? I say I got here without him. She stepped forward into the light. And I say I'd rather walk beside someone than behind. You do, he said, voice low. You don't wait for my lead. You just look at the job and do it. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the workbench. I never minded hard work. I just wanted someone who'd see it. Xander met her eyes. I see it. I see you. Something shifted between them then, quiet but sure. She didn't speak. She only moved closer, and when he reached for her, it wasn't sudden. It was steady, the way water meets stone, inevitable and right. Later, as the fire at the hearth settled into embers, she sat at the table with a half-mended shirt in her lap. He poured a splash of whiskey into a tin cup and set it beside her. "You always fix things when they break?" he asked. She threaded the needle and pulled it smooth. "Not always. Some things don't want fixing." He took a seat across from her. "And some things just need time, and hands that don't leave when it gets hard." He looked at her fingers, at the way they worked the cloth. "You ever think about what comes next?" She tied off the thread, then looked up. "I think about spring, about planting, about what kind of life we're building, not just surviving." Xander didn't speak right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, laying it gently on the table. "I bought the adjoining parcel, east side." She blinked. "When? Last time I rode into town. Figured if we're building something, we might need more room." She unfolded the paper, studied the crude plat line. "Why didn't you say?" "I was waiting to know if you'd want me to stay." "I didn't ask you to stay out of pity," she said calmly. "I asked because it felt right. I know that now." She stood, folded the paper again, and slid it back to him. "Then let's build more than a house. Let's build a life." He rose and stepped to her, resting his hand on her waist, steady and warm. "I never thought I'd want that again," he said. She looked up at him, her voice quiet but certain. "Then we'll make it worth wanting." From the loft above, Grady shifted in his sleep, and Grace mumbled something soft, curled beneath a quilt. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, rustling leaves like whispered promises. Xander pressed his forehead to hers. "They said it was a good match," he murmured. Willa smiled, her eyes shining. "The cowboy said, 'For who?'" He kissed her then, slow and sure. "For me," he said. "For us." The first snow came without warning, a soft hush falling over the land before dawn. Willa opened the door to a white world, the drifts shallow but certain, blanketing the turned soil and the new fence lines like a promise not yet spoken. The porch boards creaked under her weight as she stepped out, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Xander was already in the yard, his breath rising in clouds as he checked the horses' blankets. "You knew it had come soon," she said, voice low. He didn't look up right away. "Ground's not frozen yet. We've still got time to finish the root cellar." Willa stepped down beside him, watching as he tightened the straps on the mare's belly. "We'll need to store the squash by week's end, and the last of the beans." He brushed snow from his sleeves. "Plenty of hands now." She glanced toward the barn, where Grady and Grace were hauling straw by the armful, too busy to notice the cold. "They've taken to this place faster than I expected." Xander followed her gaze. "They trust it, and you." She shifted the shawl on her shoulders. "I think they trust you too." He nodded once, then turned toward the house. "You coming in?" Later that morning, with the children settled by the hearth stringing dried apples on twine, Willa brought out the ledger book she'd kept sealed since Kansas. She laid it on the table, its cover worn, corners softened by time. Xander looked up from sharpening his drawknife. "What's that?" "Every expense since we left Topeka, and the homestead claim details." She flipped it open, smoothing the pages. "We've got enough flour and salt to last through February, maybe longer if we stretch it, but lamp oil's nearly gone." He set the blade aside. "I'll ride into Laramie when the trail's clear." She ran her finger down a column of figures. "You shouldn't go alone. The drifts can cover the road in a day. I've made colder rides." "I know," she said, lifting her eyes, "but that was before." He didn't speak for a moment, then said, "All right, I'll wait a day or two. Weather holds, we'll go together." That evening, after the children had gone quiet in the loft, Willa sat beside Xander at the table, their knees brushing in the dim lamplight. She turned the last page of the ledger and closed the cover with care. "I got a letter once," she said, "from my father. After I married, it was short, just a few lines." Xander didn't interrupt. He said, "You've made your bed, do your best with it." Her voice didn't tremble, but her fingers tightened slightly on her lap. He never wrote again. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "He wronged you. I don't need him to be sorry." "No," he said, "but you deserve better than silence." She looked at him across the small space between them, the firelight catching in her eyes. "You ever wish you'd written someone?" "There was a girl before the war," he said after a pause. "Preacher's daughter, sweet but quiet. I left without saying goodbye." "Why?" "I didn't want her to wait on someone who might never come back." Willa tilted her head slightly. "You think she would have waited?" "I think she might have tried. But it wouldn't have been fair." She reached across the table, took his hand. "You didn't leave me." "No," he said, curling his fingers around hers. "And I won't." The wind pressed against the shutters, soft and constant. Somewhere beyond the hills a coyote called once, then fell silent. "Grady asked me this morning if we'd always live here now," she said. "What did you tell him?" I said yes. Xander's thumb moved once along the side of her hand. "That true?" She met his eyes. "For me it is." He rose then, drawing her up with him. There was no urgency in the way he held her, only the weight of something earned. She rested her forehead against his collarbone, and he breathed her in like the first warmth after a long storm. "This isn't the life I thought I'd have," she whispered. "Me neither," he said. "But I want it." He pressed a kiss to her temple, solid and full of quiet promise. "Then we'll keep it. Together." The lamp burned low, casting gold over the worn wood floor and the walls they'd raised with their own hands. Upstairs, the children stirred in their sleep, the house settling around them like it had finally found its shape. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the warmth held. The last of the squash came up from the earth just before the ground hardened fully, their skins mottled but strong. Willa set them in rows on burlap inside the newly dug root cellar, her breath rising in faint curls. She ran a palm along the stone wall Xander had mortared himself, sturdy and cool. Above, the sky had turned the color of pewter. By evening, a thin snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Xander came inside with his coat dusted white and a leather pouch in his hand. She was by the hearth, kneeling to stir the pot of oats and dried pear, when he stepped close and offered the pouch. "I traded for these in town," he said. "Figured you'd know what to do with them." She opened the flap, fingers finding smooth waxed paper, the faint scent of dried rosemary and garlic rising up from within. She looked up. "Seeds, herbs, for spring." The general store had a few packets, tucked behind a crate of nails. She folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "You remembered," he nodded once. "You talked about wanting flavor come next year." I listened. She took his hand not as a question but as an answer. "We'll find a place for them by the kitchen wall. Morning sun hits right there." He glanced around the cabin, where the boards had settled, and the seams no longer groaned in the wind. "This place is starting to feel like it's ours." "It is." He watched her for a moment longer, then stepped back to hang his coat. "Grady wants to build a sled," he said. "Said he saw some boys using one on the road near the church." She ladled oats into a tin bowl. "So long as he doesn't try it on the creek bank." I told him as much. She smiled faintly, setting the bowl on the table just as Grace padded in from the loft, rubbing her eyes. Xander lifted her easily and settled her close to the fire, tucking a shawl around her shoulders. Willa stirred the pot again. "The preacher's wife stopped me outside the mercantile. She asked if I'd take over the school come spring." He glanced over. "You said yes." I said I'd think about it. It's only a few hours a week, mostly reading and figures." She said they'd pay in goods. "You'd be good at it," she nodded slowly. "I think I might." Grady burst in from outside, red-cheeked and breathless. "Xander, I found the perfect piece of pine. It's dry and wide enough for both of us." Xander helped him peel off his gloves. "We'll shape it after chores tomorrow." Grady beamed, darting toward the fire to warm his hands. Willa scooped another bowl and passed it to Xander. "They've taken to you." He met her eyes. "I've taken to them." She sat down beside him as snow drifted against the windows. "It's not just them." He reached for her hand beneath the table, their fingers lacing easily. "I know." That night, after the children were asleep and the fire quieted to a glow, Willa unfolded a scrap of linen she'd been keeping tucked in her sewing chest. She handed it to Xander without a word. He opened it to find a worn silver ring, the edge dulled by time. "It was my mother's," she said. "She gave it to me before I left the farm, said it had seen 3 good marriages and 1 poor one." He turned it in his fingers. "You want to wear it again?" She shook her head, eyes warm. "I want to give it, if you'll have it." He stood slowly, drew her to her feet and held her gaze in the soft firelight. "I've walked through places I never meant to stay," he said. "But this land, this house, you and the children, I never want to leave it. I never want to leave you." She reached for his hand and slid the ring onto his little finger. It fit without effort. "I don't need a preacher," she said. "Just you." He kissed her quietly, reverently, his hand steady at her back. "I'll wear it every day I draw breath." They married beneath the cottonwoods behind the house come spring, the trees just beginning to bud. The preacher's wife brought a basket of bread, and the blacksmith's daughter played a fiddle tune while Grace scattered petals made from dried apple skins. Grady stood proud in a shirt 2 sizes too big, grinning wide as he handed over the ring. They spoke no vows beyond what they already lived. Shared work, shared soil, shared breath. By the time the herbs sprouted along the kitchen wall, Willa's belly had begun to round. The children knew before she said a word, Grady noticing she rose slower in the mornings, Grace curling close when she sat with her mending. Xander built a cradle from pine, his hands sure and quiet. Willa lined it with scraps of homespun cloth, blue and soft as sky. They named the child Ruth, after Willa's grandmother, and she came into the world in the early hours of a calm June morning, while the wind was still and the chickens restless in the yard. Xander held her first, his thumb brushing her cheek as she blinked up at him. "She's got your eyes," he whispered. Willa smiled, her hand resting over his. "And your steadiness." The house grew fuller, not just in sound, but in soul. The walls held laughter and music, the scent of stew and warm bread, the hush of snow and the chatter of spring birds, years past. The land gave what it could. The children grew, strong and sure. Willa taught at the schoolhouse 3 days each week, and Xander traded work with neighbors when the fields demanded more hands than 2. In the evenings, they sat on the porch with coffee and silence, their fingers always finding each other's. They didn't speak of what came before, not because it didn't matter, but because it had brought them here. And here was enough. Here was everything.